Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. History often reserves its pages for the names of great kings and conquerors, yet my heart finds its way to the quiet souls much like yours. You have stepped through the long seasons of a life, weathered its storms, and gathered your own harvest of both bitterness and sweetness. A human life may seem like a fleeting moment in the vastness of time, but your footsteps, however silent they may feel, are a precious and vital part of this world's story. So tonight, as we travel back to a harsher time, let the inner child within you curl up in peace. You have carried enough. You deserve to be sheltered. Now let your mind drift backward. Forget the bright colors of modern outdoor gear. Forget the GPS satellites orbiting overhead. Forget everything you know about how we survive in the wilderness today. Travel with me to the year 1830. The Rocky Mountains stretch endless and unforgiving across the spine of a continent that has barely been mapped. A man stands at the edge of a frozen creek, his breath forming crystals in the air before him. He wears animal skins that he tanned himself with the brains of the creatures he killed. His rifle is a flintlock that can fail in wet weather. His shelter tonight will be whatever he can construct from branches and snow. He has no phone, no GPS, no weather forecast, no rescue helicopter waiting on standby. By every measure of modern logic, he should perish in these conditions. The odds are stacked impossibly against him. Yet not only does he survive, he thrives here. He spends entire winters, sometimes years at a time, in conditions that would kill most of us within hours. He understands something that we have largely forgotten. What was it? How did these mountain men master an environment that still defeats us despite all our technology? The answer lies not in what they carried, but in what they knew. They understood that cold was not simply the absence of warmth, but an active predator that hunted in specific ways. They knew it attacked through 4 distinct methods: through conduction, stealing heat wherever skins touched stone or metal; through convection, as wind ripped away the precious envelope of warm air around their bodies; through radiation, as their own warmth leaked away into the frozen darkness; and through evaporation, as moisture drew heat from them like an invisible thief. This knowledge was not learned from books. It was paid for in blood, in frostbitten fingers, and toes in friends who made small mistakes and vanished into the snow never to be seen again. Every technique, every habit, every small ritual of survival was purchased at the cost of human suffering. And yet, there was something else here too, something that goes beyond mere technique. In the coldest, most isolated places on Earth, these men found not just survival, but a strange kind of peace. In the silence of winter, in the complete absence of civilization's noise, something essential about being human became clear. Tonight, we're going to explore that knowledge together. We're going to understand how a person could not just survive, but find meaning in a world of ice and stone. We're going to learn what it really meant to face winter without any safety net, without any illusion that rescue was coming. So take a slow breath now. Feel your shoulders relax. Let whatever tensions you're carrying begin to dissolve. The story I'm about to share with you spans months and years, but we're in no hurry. Time moves differently in the winter wilderness. Days blend into weeks. The passage of the sun becomes the only clock, and in that slowing down, in that complete surrender to the rhythm of survival, there is something almost meditative. Are you comfortable? Is the light dim enough? Good. Then let us step together through the threshold, back into the winter of 1830, where the cold was absolute and the silence was broken only by the wind, and where a certain kind of human being learned to call that frozen world home. To survive, you must stop viewing cold as a condition and start seeing it as an active hunter. It is a patient, invisible force that breathes down your neck relentlessly, searching for a way inside your skin. It doesn't just happen to you. It pursues you, driven by a singular, tireless instinct to steal the very life from your bones. The mountain men of the 1830s understood this intimately. They didn't have our modern physics terminology, but they knew with absolute certainty that cold attacked them in 4 distinct ways. They had names for these attacks learned through brutal experience. Let's explore each one slowly so you can feel what they felt. Imagine you're there. It's early December in the Rocky Mountains. You've been walking since before dawn, and now as the pale sun begins to sink toward the western peaks, you need to stop for the night. Your legs ache. Your feet are numb inside your moccasins, though you've lined them carefully with dried grass. You're looking for a place to camp. You see a large boulder, and your first instinct might be to lean against it, to rest your back against something solid. But you don't, because you know the first killer: conduction, the transfer of heat through direct contact. Place your bare hand against stone when the temperature is 40 degrees below zero, and within seconds you'll feel it. The rock doesn't simply feel cold. It actively drinks the warmth from your palm, pulling it away from you, molecule by molecule. Your skin cells begin to die. Ice crystals form in your tissue. The pain is extraordinary, at first, then vanishes into numbness as the nerve endings freeze. The mountain men learned to fear certain kinds of contact. Stone and metal were the worst. A rifle barrel at 40 below could take the skin off your palm if you grabbed it bare-handed. The mountain men would wrap their rifle stocks in leather and fur, not for comfort, but for survival. They knew that losing even one finger to frostbite could mean the difference between bringing down game and starving. So what do instead of sitting on stone? You gather pine boughs, thick ones, still green if possible, because dead ones crunch and collapse. You lay them down in a mat, creating a barrier between your body and the frozen ground. This isn't about comfort, though. Comfort is a welcome side effect. It's about creating a layer of trapped air, because air, when it's still, is one of nature's finest insulators. You kneel on this bed of pine, and already you can feel the difference. The cold is still there, all around you, pressing in from every direction. But it's not pulling heat directly from your knees anymore. You've won the first small battle. But cold has other weapons. As you kneel there on your bed of pine boughs, you become aware of the wind. It's been present all day, a constant pressure against your face. But now, as you stop moving, you feel its power more clearly. The wind in the Rocky Mountains in winter is not like wind anywhere else. It comes down from Canada, sweeping across hundreds of miles of frozen plain, gathering cold as it travels. By the time it reaches the high passes, it's moving at 30, sometimes 40 miles per hour, and it's cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. This is the second killer: convection, the theft of heat by moving air. Even if you've created perfect insulation against conduction, even if you're not touching anything cold, the wind can still destroy you. Here's why. Your body works constantly to maintain a thin envelope of warmth around your skin. This layer, perhaps a quarter-inch thick, is heated by the blood flowing just beneath your skin's surface. In still air, this envelope can be maintained with relatively little energy, but wind strips it away. Every gust removes that warm layer and replaces it with fresh, cold air, forcing your body to heat a new layer only to have that stolen too. It's like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. Eventually, your body cannot keep up. Your core temperature begins to drop. Hypothermia sets in subtle at first, then catastrophic. The mountain men had a term for this, though it wasn't scientific. They called it the wind that cuts, and they knew how to hide from it. You look around at the landscape. Everything is potential shelter or potential exposure. That open meadow, though it might have good visibility, is a death trap because the wind has nothing to slow it down. The stands of evergreen trees, however, those dense clusters of pine and spruce, they break the wind. Between the trees, the air is still. Not warm, but still. And stillness is survival. You move toward the tree line leading your horse, if you have one, carrying your pack, if you don't. Every step is deliberate conserving energy. You've learned not to sweat because sweat is the fourth killer, though we'll come to that shortly. You've learned to move steadily, but not strenuously, to maintain your body's heat without overtaxing it. Among the trees, the wind's howl becomes a distant thing. You can hear it above you in the branches, but here at ground level, the air is almost calm. You've defeated the second killer, at least for now. But there's a third way that cold comes for you, and this one is invisible, insidious operating, even in perfect stillness. Radiation. The loss of heat through electromagnetic waves. Your body, even when you're doing nothing, radiates heat constantly, like a small furnace broadcasting its warmth into the void. On a summer day, this is pleasant. In winter, at 40 below, it's a hemorrhage of precious energy. Every moment you're bleeding heat into the frozen air, and unlike the heat lost to conduction or convection, there's no obvious point of contact, no wind to fight against. You just grow colder degree by degree in a silence that seems peaceful but is actually lethal. The mountain men understood this in their bones. They knew that night was more dangerous than day, not just because of the cold, but because of the darkness. At night, your body radiates heat toward the vast heat sink of space itself. The clear winter sky, beautiful and star-filled, is actually an infinite void at nearly absolute zero. Your body heat flows toward it like water flowing downhill. So, what do? You build a reflector. On the edge of your camp, opposite from where you'll sleep, you build a wall. Not a wall for privacy or protection from animals, though it serves those purposes too. A wall to bounce your fire's heat back toward you. You find the straightest dead logs you can, still standing trees that have dried in place, and you stack them at an angle leaning back slightly. You pack the gaps with smaller branches. You might weave pine boughs into it for density. Then when you build your fire, the heat doesn't simply radiate out in all directions and disappear into the cold. It hits the wall and bounces back, creating a pocket of relative warmth where you'll spend the night. The wall glows with absorbed heat, becoming itself a secondary heat source. This is knowledge that takes years to refine. The angle of the wall matters. Too steep, and the heat rises uselessly overhead. Too shallow, and the heat doesn't reflect efficiently. But once you understand it, once you've built hundreds of these reflectors, you can feel the difference immediately. Instead of one side of your body freezing, while the other cooks, you're bathed in warmth from multiple angles. Still, there's one more killer to account for. The subtlest, and in some ways, the most dangerous. Evaporation, the cooling effect of moisture turning to vapor. Water, as it changes from liquid to gas, absorbs enormous amounts of heat from whatever it's touching. This is why a damp cloth feels colder than a dry one, even at the same temperature. This is why a wet dog shivers. And this is why sweat, that magnificent cooling system for hot climates, becomes a deadly enemy in the extreme cold. The mountain men learned to fear their own perspiration. If you exerted yourself too hard, if you chopped wood too vigorously, or walked too fast uphill, you would sweat. And once that moisture soaked into your inner layers, it was almost impossible to get dry again. The water would freeze against your skin, creating a layer of ice inside your clothing. You'd be wearing your own death, a cold that no external fire could easily reach. So they moved carefully, deliberately. They learned to gauge their exertion precisely to stay just warm enough without overheating. If they felt sweat beginning to form, they would stop, open their coat to let the cool air in, allow their body temperature to drop slightly before continuing. And if they did get wet from snow falling inside their collar, or from crossing a creek, or from a dozen other accidents that could happen in the wilderness, they had to deal with it immediately. There was no waiting until evening, no tolerating slight discomfort. Wetness was an emergency. You stopped everything else and addressed it, because wetness in temperatures that cold was the beginning of death. Perhaps you're beginning to understand now why a modern hiker, despite all the advantages of technology, might still perish, while a mountain man from 1830 would survive. It's not about the quality of your gear. It's about understanding how cold operates, how it moves, how it finds you. The mountain man didn't fight against cold. He couldn't. It was too vast, too patient, too overwhelming. Instead, he learned to dance with it, to move in the spaces where its weapons couldn't easily reach him. He kept still air around his body. He reflected heat back toward himself. He stayed dry. He never touched metal or stone with bare skin. These were not tips or tricks. They were laws as immutable as gravity. And slowly, hour by hour, day by day, through a winter that stretched from October to April, he survived. Not through heroics, but through perfect, unrelenting attention to small details. Each one of those details, learned through observation and bitter experience, was the difference between waking up the next morning and becoming another frozen story, another cautionary tale about the man who thought he understood, but didn't. The fire crackles beside you now as you imagine this scene. You've built it properly, starting small, nursing it to life. The warmth on your face is real and precious. Beyond its circle of light, the darkness is complete, and the cold is absolute. But here in this small pocket of defiance, you've created something that the wilderness, for all its power, cannot immediately destroy. This is the first great knowledge, the understanding that cold is not your enemy to be conquered, but a force to be respected, understood, and carefully navigated. Every mountain man who survived more than one winter had learned this lesson. Those who didn't learn it left their bones scattered across the mountains, silent testimony to the price of ignorance. Tomorrow the dance begins again. But tonight you're alive. The fire burns. Your layers are dry. And that, in the winter of 1830 in the Rocky Mountains, is everything. There's a moment just before full sleep comes when the body releases its last holding tension and surrenders to rest. Can you feel that moment approaching? Not yet, perhaps, but soon. Let it come gently. There's no rushing these things. We're still in those mountains, you and I, though the scene shifts now. The morning after that first night, the mountain man rises in the dark hours before dawn. His breath fogs in the air inside his small shelter. The fire has burned down to coals still radiating a little warmth, but not enough. Outside, the thermometer, if he had one, would read somewhere around 50 degrees below zero. But he doesn't need a thermometer. His body tells him everything he needs to know. He doesn't leap up. That would be wasteful of energy and dangerous besides. Instead, he moves slowly, deliberately maintaining the warmth his body generated during sleep. He feeds the fire first, not large pieces of wood, but small dry twigs that will catch easily from the coals. He blows gently his breath, adding just enough oxygen. A small flame licks up. He adds slightly larger pieces. The fire rebuilds itself, and only then does he fully emerge from his sleeping robes. Now comes the ritual that every mountain man perfected, the daily calibration that meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The ritual of layering. Clothing in the winter wilderness is not fashion or protection from embarrassment. It's a survival system as complex and essential as any piece of modern technology. But it operates on principles that are both simple and profound. The goal is not to stay warm exactly. The goal is to maintain the precise balance between too cold and too warm, between freezing and sweating, between stillness and movement. Think of it as a conversation between your body and the environment mediated through fabric and fur. Your body speaks in heat and moisture. The environment speaks in cold and wind. The clothing translates between them, modulating, adjusting, protecting. The mountain man's base layer closest to his skin was almost always wool. Not the soft merino wool of modern athletic wear, but rough, scratchy wool from sheep, still containing much of the natural lanolin that made it water-resistant. This wool had an almost magical property that the mountain men understood, but couldn't quite explain. It remained warm, even when wet. If you've ever worn wet cotton, you know the terrible, clammy cold it produces. Cotton, when wet, is worse than useless. It's actively dangerous, drawing heat away from your body with shocking efficiency. But wool, even when it's absorbed 30% of its weight in water, still maintains about 80% of its insulating ability. The lanolin in the fibers repels water to some degree, and the crimped structure of wool fibers traps air even when damp. The mountain men didn't know the science, but they knew the result. They wore wool long underwear if they could get it, or wool shirts at the very least. These garments would be worn for months without washing, and not just because washing was difficult. The accumulated body oils and dirt actually enhanced the wool's water-repelling properties. What we might see as filth, they understood as seasoning, as breaking in the garment to work properly. Over the wool came leather, specifically buckskin, the tanned hide of a deer, usually worked soft with the deer's own brains. This was the middle layer, the wind barrier. Buckskin, when properly prepared, had a texture unlike any modern material. It was supple, almost cloth-like, but with a density that blocked wind completely. And unlike woven cloth, it didn't have tiny gaps between threads where cold air could infiltrate. The buckskin shirt and pants were typically fringed along the seams and hems. These fringes weren't decoration, though they certainly had a distinctive appearance that we now associate with frontier life. They were functional. Water, whether from rain, snow, or condensation, would run along the surface of the leather and collect at the bottom. Without fringes, it would pool and soak in. With fringes, the water would travel down those dangling strips and drip away from the main garment, keeping the bulk of the leather relatively dry. The mountain man dresses slowly, methodically. First the wool, then the buckskin. He checks the leather carefully, running his hands over it, feeling for stiff spots where it might have absorbed moisture the day before and frozen overnight. If he finds such spots, he'll work them between his hands, flexing the leather, warming it, restoring its suppleness. A stiff spot ignored could crack. A crack could let wind through. Wind through meant cold reaching skin. Cold on skin meant the beginning of frostbite. Over the buckskin, depending on the severity of the cold, came additional layers. Perhaps a vest made from the fur of a wolf or coyote, worn with the fur against the body for maximum warmth. The long guard hairs of canine fur were particularly good at shedding snow and ice. Or perhaps a shirt made from the tanned skin of a mountain sheep, thicker than buckskin, more wind-resistant still. And finally, the capote. This was the outer shell, the final defense against winter's assault. A capote was essentially a blanket converted into a coat, usually made from wool traded from the Hudson's Bay Company. These blankets were called point blankets because they were marked with short black lines, or points that indicated their size and weight. A 3-point blanket made a capote that came to the mid-thigh. A 4-point blanket made one that reached almost to the knees. The capote was typically white or cream-colored, which served multiple purposes. White didn't show dirt as readily as darker colors, which matters when you're wearing the same garment for 6 months. More importantly, light colors were less likely to spook game when hunting. The buffalo and elk of the mountains had learned to fear dark shapes that moved, but a man wrapped in a light-colored capote moving slowly could be mistaken for a pale boulder or a snow-covered stump until he was close enough for a shot. This outer layer was loose, deliberately so. Air trapped between the layers was the real insulator, and if the clothing was too tight, that air couldn't exist. The mountain man could regulate his temperature by opening or closing the capote, by lifting or lowering the hood, by rolling up or unrolling the sleeves. Each adjustment changed the airflow, changed the rate of heat loss or retention. But here's what's crucial to understand. This system was dynamic. It had to be adjusted constantly throughout the day. In the morning, when breaking camp, when movement was vigorous, the mountain man might wear only his wool and buckskin with the capote rolled and tied to his pack. The exertion of work kept him warm enough, but the moment the work stopped, the moment he stood still to scan for game or to check his direction, he'd feel the cold creeping in. Within minutes, he'd pull on the capote. Walking on level ground, he might wear all his layers, but keep the capote open to the front, allowing some heat to escape. Climbing uphill, he'd open it further, perhaps even drape it over his shoulders, rather than wearing it properly. The goal was always the same: stay warm enough to prevent chilling, but not so warm that he sweated. This constant calibration required attention that modern people rarely have to maintain. We enter climate-controlled buildings. We adjust thermostats with a flick of the wrist, but the mountain man's body was his climate, and his clothing was the control system, and he had to monitor and adjust it every hour, sometimes every few minutes, all day long, every day for months. On his hands, mittens, not gloves. This is important. Mittens keep the fingers together, allowing them to share warmth. They're far more effective than gloves at preventing frostbite, but mittens also make fine work impossible. So the mountain man's mittens had a slit in the palm, and inside that slit was a thin glove, often made from the soft leather of a young deer. When he needed to load his rifle, or tie a knot, or perform any delicate task, he could slip his hand out of the mitten while keeping it inside the outer shell, protected from the worst of the wind. On his head, a fur cap, often made from the entire pelt of a fox or beaver with the tail still attached. The head loses heat faster than any other part of the body relative to its surface area. The brain, that energy-hungry organ, requires constant blood flow, and blood carries heat. Without a cap, a person could lose 40% of their total heat production through their head. With a proper fur cap, that loss was reduced to nearly nothing. And on his feet, perhaps the most critical element of all moccasins. Modern people often romanticize moccasins as primitive footwear less effective than boots. This is a profound misunderstanding. Moccasins, when properly made and maintained, were superior to any boot for winter wilderness travel. Here's why. Moccasins were made from a single piece of leather, usually elk or moose hide, pulled up around the foot and sewn at the top. There was no hard sole, no separation between layers. This meant that the moccasin moved with the foot flexing naturally, allowing full sensitivity to the ground underneath. On rocky terrain, or when walking on snow-covered ice, this sensitivity was crucial. You could feel where you were placing your weight. Inside the moccasins, the mountain man would stuff dried grass, or, if available, the soft inner bark of sagebrush. This provided insulation and also absorbed any moisture from sweat. Each evening, he'd remove the grass, let it dry by the fire, and the next morning pack fresh grass inside. The leather of the moccasins would be treated regularly with animal fat rubbed in, while warm, creating a water-resistant surface that remained supple in the cold. And if you're wondering about snow getting inside them, that was managed too. The mountain man wore leggings, separate sleeves of leather that covered from the ankle to just above the knee, tied with leather thongs. These were separate from the pants, which allowed for easy removal when they got wet. Snow would pile up on the leggings, but rarely got down inside the moccasins. When everything was properly adjusted, properly maintained, this system of clothing created an environment around the body that was nearly perfect for survival. Not necessarily comfortable in the way we think of comfort, but balanced. The mountain man might still feel cold, but it was a manageable cold, a cold that wasn't actively killing him. Compare this to the modern hiker wrapped in a $700 jacket that promises breathability and waterproofing through a membrane of expanded polytetrafluoroethylene. The jacket works beautifully until it tears, until the waterproof coating begins to delaminate after a few seasons, until the zipper breaks, and in the wilderness, with no way to repair it, that expensive jacket becomes just a piece of ripped fabric. The mountain man's clothing, by contrast, could be repaired with nothing more than an awl and a length of sinew. A torn seam could be resewn. A hole could be patched. The entire system was maintainable with the materials at hand. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of all. The mountain men didn't have better materials than we do. They had materials they understood completely. Materials they could work with, repair, modify. They weren't dependent on a supply chain stretching across oceans. Everything they needed, they either carried with them or could create from the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. The sun is higher now in your imagined scene. The mountain man has finished dressing. His layers are precisely calibrated for the day ahead. He checks his rifle checks. His pack checks the sky for signs of weather change. And then he begins to walk steady and unhurried through a landscape that would kill an unprepared person in hours. But he is not unprepared. He's wrapped in knowledge as surely as he's wrapped in leather and fur. And that knowledge passed down from man to man through instruction and example and bitter experience is more valuable than any modern fabric technology could ever be. Let that thought settle into your mind as you feel your own blankets around you, your own warmth preserved. You're safe. You're comfortable. And somewhere in the past, in a winter that was real and harsh and beautiful, someone else understood how to maintain that same precious warmth through nothing but attention and skill. Sleep is closer now, isn't it good? Let it come. There's a sound you may have heard before without really listening to it. The soft crackle of a fire, the gentle pop of a burning log, the whisper of flames consuming wood and releasing heat into cold air. If you close your eyes and imagine it now, you can almost feel the warmth on your face, can't you? The way one side of your body grows warm while the other stays cool. The dance of light against your closed eyelids. The smell of wood smoke, ancient and comforting. Fire in the modern world is recreational. We light candles for ambience. We gather around backyard fire pits for social events. Fire is pleasant, nostalgic something that connects us to a simpler time. We can enjoy it or not as we choose because we have other sources of heat. Central heating, electric blankets, insulated homes. Fire is optional. But in the winter wilderness of the 1830s, fire was not optional. It was the difference between life and death as fundamental as breathing. Without fire, the mountain man could not survive a single night when temperatures dropped below zero. Without fire, he could not melt snow for drinking water. Without fire, he could not cook food or dry wet clothing, or see in the darkness or signal his location to companions. Fire was everything. And yet making fire, maintaining fire, understanding fire, required more skill than almost anything else in the mountain man's repertoire of survival knowledge. Let's explore this slowly, carefully, because the story of fire is really the story of human persistence against enormous odds. Imagine, if you will, that you're back in those mountains on a day in mid-January. You've been traveling since dawn, leading your horse through snow that reaches to your knees in places. The sky is that hard, pale blue that promises extreme cold. Your breath forms clouds that freeze on your beard if you have one, creating a mask of ice around your mouth. The temperature is perhaps 20 degrees below zero, but there's no wind, which is a mercy. You can function in this cold as long as you keep moving. But now, the sun is dropping toward the western peaks, and you know you have perhaps an hour before darkness. You need to make camp. More specifically, you need to make fire, and you need to make it while you still have light and while your hands are still functional. The mountain men called fire-making the Holy Trinity, and they were only half joking. The Trinity consisted of 3 elements, each one essential: flint, steel, and charcloth. Without all 3 working in perfect concert, you had no fire. and without fire, you had very few options in sub-zero wilderness. Let's start with the flint. This is a piece of stone, usually dark grey or black, that has a particular property when struck sharply with steel. It shaves off tiny particles of the steel, and the friction of that impact heats those particles to over 1500 degrees Celsius for a split second. That's hot enough to create a visible spark. But here's what's crucial finding. The right flint was not trivial. Not every rock would work. The stone needed to be hard enough to strike steel, but brittle enough to create the shearing action that produced sparks. The mountain men learned to recognize flint by its conchoidal fracture pattern, the way it broke in smooth, curved surfaces like glass. They learned where to find it, often along creek beds or exposed rock faces. And when they found a good piece, they guarded it carefully, because a lost flint could be catastrophic. The steel was usually a specific tool called a striker or a fire steel, a piece of high-carbon steel formed into a C shape or an oval that could be held in the hand. But in desperate circumstances, the spine of a knife or even a piece of a broken gun lock could work. The mountain men knew that different steels produced different qualities of sparks. Soft steel didn't work at all. The steel needed to be hard enough to create that explosive shower of glowing particles when struck. But even perfect flint and steel were useless without the third element, something to catch the spark. This is where char cloth came in, and this is where the real artistry began. Char cloth was made from cotton or linen fabric that had been burned in a low-oxygen environment, essentially charcoalized. The process required a small tin container with a tiny hole punched in the lid. You'd place pieces of cotton cloth inside, seal it, and then put the tin directly into a fire. The heat would begin to burn the cloth, but because there was very little oxygen inside the tin, the cloth couldn't burst into flame. Instead, it would smolder and carbonize. When smoke stopped coming out of the tiny hole in the lid, you'd remove the tin and let it cool. Inside would be char cloth, black, fragile, and absolutely essential. Char cloth would catch a spark from flint and steel and hold it glowing, giving you precious seconds to transfer that spark to tinder. It was one of the most valuable substances in the mountain man's possessions. But making char cloth required fire to begin with, which creates an interesting paradox. You needed fire to make the tool that would help you make fire. This meant that a mountain man, once he had fire going, would always take the time to make more char cloth, building up a supply for future use. Losing your char cloth supply was a serious emergency, so you're standing there as the sun sinks and you need fire. Your hands are cold, but not yet dangerously so. You've scouted a good spot out of any drainage where cold air might pool near enough to trees for wood supply, but with enough open sky that smoke won't suffocate you. You've gathered your materials. First, the tinder bundle. This was not just any random bundle of dry stuff. This was carefully constructed, almost like a bird's nest. The finest material went in the center, perhaps the inner bark of sagebrush rubbed between the palms until it separated into fibers as fine as thread. Around that went slightly coarser material, maybe dried grass or thin strips of birch bark. The whole thing was about the size of 2 fists, fluffy, full of air spaces, ready to accept the burning char cloth and transform the tiny coal into flame. Next, the kindling. Sticks no thicker than a match, then progressively larger twigs and small branches, all arranged in a specific order. Dead lower branches from pine trees still on the tree were ideal. They'd been kept dry by the tree itself, protected from ground moisture and snow. The mountain man would snap them off, listening for that dry crack that indicated zero moisture content. Wet wood wouldn't catch, and trying to use it was a waste of the precious spark. Finally, larger wood, but not yet. First, just get the fire started. Everything else could wait. Now the moment of ignition. From a pouch usually worn around the neck or kept in the warmest part of his clothing, to prevent moisture from condensing on it, the mountain man would extract his flint striker and a piece of char cloth. This part required bare hands, or at least partially bare. The mittens had to come off. The exposed skin began to hurt almost immediately in the cold, which meant working quickly, but not hurriedly. Haste led to mistakes. He'd hold the char cloth on top of the flint, pinched between thumb and the stone surface. Then, with a sharp downward strike of the steel against the flint's edge, he'd send a shower of sparks onto the cloth. Most would die instantly, but one, if his technique was right, would catch. The char cloth would begin to glow, a tiny orange coal, no bigger than a pinhead at first. It required oxygen to grow, but not too much. Too much airflow, and it would cool and die. Too little, and it would suffocate. This was the delicate moment. The mountain man would gently blow on the char cloth, watching the glow intensify spread. When the entire piece was glowing brightly, he'd carefully transfer it to the center of his tinder bundle. Now came the critical part. He'd wrap the tinder bundle around the glowing char cloth, enclosing it, but not smothering it. Then he'd lift the entire bundle and blow into it steadily, rhythmically, giving the coal the oxygen it desperately needed to grow. The tinder closest to the coal would begin to smoke. Wisps at first, then thicker plumes. The smoke would sting his eyes, but he'd keep blowing steady, patient. And then suddenly, with a sensation that never got old, no matter how many hundreds of times he'd done it, with a soft whooshing sound that seemed like the breath of some small god, the tinder bundle would burst into flame. Yellow fire would race through the dry fibers, consuming them, generating heat-light security. He'd quickly but carefully set the burning bundle down in his prepared fire pit and begin adding the smallest kindling. Each piece added had to be slightly larger than the last, giving the fire time to grow in strength. Too much wood too soon would smother it. Too little, and it would die from lack of fuel. But if done correctly, if every step was executed with the precision born of practice and necessity, within a few minutes, there would be a fire. A real fire, hot enough to drive back the cold, bright enough to illuminate the coming darkness. The relief, the satisfaction of that moment is something our modern world rarely offers. We flick switches, we turn knobs, we have instant heat, instant light. But the mountain man earned his fire. He created it from stone and steel and carbonized cloth and his own knowledge and breath. It was his in a way that our borrowed warmth from distant power plants can never be. But what if the flint was lost? What if the char cloth was exhausted and there was no fire to make more? What if the steel striker broke? The mountain men had backup methods, though all were more difficult. One was the bow drill, a technique borrowed from indigenous peoples. This involved a wooden spindle spun rapidly against a wooden baseboard by means of a bow and string, creating enough friction to generate an ember in wood dust. It worked, but it required dry wood, and in winter, truly dry wood could be hard to find. It required physical strength and coordination. It took time, sometimes 20 minutes or more of continuous effort. But it was possible, and knowledge of how to do it was insurance against disaster. Another method rarely used, but known, was the burning glass. A lens, perhaps from a spyglass, or a pair of spectacles could focus sunlight into a point hot enough to ignite tinder. But this required sun, and winter in the Rockies often meant weeks of overcast skies. Still, some mountain men carried a small lens for exactly this purpose. But the primary method was always flint steel and char cloth, the holy trinity. And the mountain men protected these items with their lives, sometimes literally. Osborne Russell, in his journals, mentions checking his fire-starting kit multiple times a day, keeping it dry, keeping it accessible. It was part of the rhythm of survival, like breathing. Once fire was established, the work of maintaining it began. This was not like tending a modern fireplace, where the goal is aesthetics and moderate warmth. This was industrial-scale heat production against lethal cold. The mountain man needed coals that would last through the night, radiating steady heat. He needed flames high enough to cook with, but controlled enough not to waste wood. He needed enough heat to dry wet clothing and gear without scorching them. This required understanding wood in a way that goes far beyond modern casual knowledge. Different woods burned with different characteristics, and the mountain man needed to know them all. Pine and other softwoods burned hot and fast, excellent for quick heat or for boiling water, but they didn't produce lasting coals. Hardwoods, like oak or maple when available, burned more slowly and produced coals that could smolder all night. But in the high Rockies, true hardwoods were rare. The mountain man learned to work with what he had: lodgepole pine, spruce, aspen, cottonwood along the river bottoms. He learned that dead wood still standing on the tree was drier than any wood lying on the ground, even if the ground wood looked dry. He learned that wood from the south-facing side of a tree was denser and burned longer than wood from the north side because it had grown more slowly in the shadier, cooler conditions. He learned to split frozen wood carefully, watching for the explosive cracks that could occur when moisture expanded in the grain. And he learned the architecture of fire, not just piling wood randomly, but building it with purpose. The reflector wall behind him bouncing heat forward. The fire itself arranged in specific patterns depending on need. Sometimes a star fire with large logs arranged like spokes, radiating from a central point, the ends burning while the bulk of the logs remained unlit, providing fuel for hours without tending. Sometimes a log cabin structure for cooking with good airflow underneath, and a flat top for a pot. Sometimes a long fire, a single row of burning logs for multiple people to lie beside each person, getting equal heat. All of this knowledge, all of these techniques were in service of a single goal: staying warm enough through the night to still be alive when dawn came. The psychological importance of fire cannot be overstated. Yes, it provided physical warmth and light, but it provided something else too, something harder to quantify but equally vital. It provided companionship. In the vast silence and darkness of winter wilderness, a fire was a presence, almost a living thing. Its crackling was conversation. Its light was company. Many mountain men wrote about talking to their fires, about feeling less alone because of the flames. The fire separated the circle of human control from the surrounding wilderness. Inside the fire's light, there was order, warmth, life. Outside was chaos, cold, the unknown. The fire was the boundary between. And so the mountain man would sit his front warm from the flames, his back cold from the night air, and he would be grateful. Not in some abstract way, but with a physical, visceral gratitude that came from knowing, absolutely knowing, what the absence of fire meant. Your own eyes are perhaps growing heavy now as you imagine this scene. The fire burns in your mind, warming some deep part of you that remembers even across all the centuries and miles what it meant to humans before we had easy heat. Let that warmth spread through you. Let it relax whatever tightness remains in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. The fire burns on, as it always has, as it always will in memory and story. And you are safe. You are warm. The night cannot reach you here. Morning comes slowly in the mountains, a gradual brightening of the eastern sky that spreads like spilled milk across the darkness. The stars fade one by one. The air, if possible, grows even colder in that hour before dawn, as if the night is making one final effort to assert itself before the sun returns. The mountain man stirs in his blankets. The fire has burned low down to a bed of coals that still glow faintly orange when he blows on them. His breath, even that small exertion, sends up a visible cloud in the frigid air. He knows without checking that the temperature has dropped to perhaps 30 below during the night. He knows because his water skin, despite being wrapped in his blankets with him, has frozen solid. He knows because the moccasins he placed carefully by the fire, hoping they'd stay pliable, have stiffened into shapes that barely resemble footwear. But he also knows how to manage all of this. He's done it hundreds of times before. First, the fire. Everything begins and ends with fire. He adds small twigs to the coals, watches them catch adds slightly larger pieces. Within a few minutes, he has flames again. The heat on his face is immediate and wonderful, chasing away the bone-deep chill that accumulated during the night. He sets a pot of snow near the flames to begin the slow process of melting it for water. While the snow melts, he works his moccasins closer to the fire, rotating them, allowing the heat to penetrate the frozen leather and restore its flexibility. Too close, and the leather will scorch and weaken. Too far, and it will stay frozen. He judges the distance by feel, by experience, by an understanding of materials that comes from necessity. Around him, the forest is waking. Not with bird calls, most birds have fled to lower, warmer elevations for the winter, but with the subtle sounds of trees responding to temperature changes, the crack of expanding ice in the wood, the creak of branches, the soft thump of snow sliding off a bough and landing below. These sounds are part of a language the mountain man has learned to read fluently. The forest talks to those who know how to listen, and in winter, when survival depends on making the right choices about something as simple as fuel for a fire, that language becomes crucial. Let's explore this language together slowly, because it's a beautiful and complex thing that our modern world has largely forgotten. The first lesson is this: not all wood is created equal. This seems obvious, but the implications run deep. In winter conditions, choosing the wrong wood for your fire could mean struggling all night to maintain heat, wasting energy, potentially even failing to keep the fire going when the temperature drops dangerously low in the hours before dawn. The mountain men divided wood into several categories, though they didn't use scientific terms. They thought in terms of what the wood could do for them. There was quick-burning wood used for getting a fire started, or for cooking when you needed high heat fast. This was the realm of softwoods, pine, spruce, fir. These trees grew relatively quickly, which meant their wood was less dense with wider growth rings and more space for resin. When burned, that resin created intense flames and pleasant-smelling smoke. A handful of dry pine needles could catch fire from a single spark and be blazing within seconds. A pine cone full of resin pockets could burn hot enough to ignite larger wood. But these quick-burning woods had a drawback. They didn't make good coals. They'd flame brightly for 10 or 15 minutes, then collapse into ash, providing little lasting heat. If you built your entire night fire from softwood, you'd wake multiple times to feed it, and each time you woke, you'd have lost precious body heat from your sleeping position. So for the long night, Burns the Mountain Man wanted hardwood coals. But here's the problem. True, hardwoods like oak or hickory or maple were scarce at high elevations. They grew in the lower valleys, and a mountain man might not visit those areas for months at a time. He had to work with what the high country provided. Aspen was one option. The white-barked aspen groves that dotted the mountainsides were beautiful in summer, but sparse and wind-rattled in winter. Aspen was technically a hardwood, and it did produce better coals than pine. But it was light, almost porous, and a winter's worth of aspen fuel would require enormous amounts of wood cutting. Still, it was better than nothing. Cottonwood along the creek bottoms was another option. Similar to aspen, but often with thicker trunks. The mountain men would sometimes make winter camp near cottonwood stands for exactly this reason, knowing they'd have adequate fuel within easy reach. But the prized wood, when it could be found, was mountain mahogany. Despite the name, it wasn't true mahogany, but it was dense and hard. And it burned with intense heat, creating coals that could last through even the coldest nights. A fire built from mountain mahogany was a treasure, and the mountain men would note the locations of good stands in their mental maps, returning to them season after season. Beyond the species of wood, there was the matter of its condition. Green wood, freshly cut, contained too much moisture and would hiss and steam rather than burn. It took energy from the fire rather than adding to it, avoided whenever possible. Dead wood, but recently dead, was only slightly better. It might burn but sluggishly with a lot of smoke and little heat. The ideal was dead wood that had dried while still standing. This was called standing dead, or widowmakers, because the trees while dead were often unstable and could fall unexpectedly, killing an unwary woodcutter. But the wood inside these standing dead trees was perfectly seasoned, protected from ground moisture by the bark and by being elevated in the air where sun and wind could work on it. This wood would burn hot and clean with minimal smoke. Identifying standing dead required looking up constantly as you moved through the forest. The mountain man would scan for trees with no needles or leaves with bark starting to peel away with that particular grey weathering that indicated death, but not yet decay. He'd approach carefully, check for stability, and if the tree seemed safe to work with, he'd cut or break off what he needed. But even standing dead wood varied in quality. The side of the tree facing the prevailing winds would be drier. The branches on the south side, which received more sun, would be drier than those on the north. The top of the tree, which had been exposed to air longest, would be drier than the bottom. A mountain man cutting wood wasn't just chopping randomly. He was selecting, curating, choosing pieces based on specific characteristics that would affect how they burned. Then there was the matter of size. Different purposes required different sizes of wood, and the mountain man would gather a range all at once, so he didn't have to go looking in the dark when the fire needed feeding. Tinder materials so fine it would catch from a spark. Shredded bark, pine needles, dry grass wood shavings. Kindling thumb-sized twigs and small branches. The foundation on which the fire would grow. Squaw wood, wrist-sized pieces, named after indigenous women who often gathered firewood. These would burn for 20 or 30 minutes, bridging the gap between kindling and larger fuel. Cooking wood, forearm-sized splits that could maintain steady heat for an hour or more. Night logs as thick as you could cut, sometimes as large as your thigh. These weren't meant to flame, but to smoulder, producing coals that would last for hours. A proper evening of wood gathering might take 2 hours, and at the end of it, the mountain man would have an organized pile representing each category. It was work done in daylight and good health, so that night, when cold and exhaustion set in, the wood would simply be there, ready to be used in the right sequence. The act of cutting wood in sub-zero temperatures was itself a skill requiring knowledge. Metal became brittle in extreme cold. An axe head could shatter if struck wrong against frozen wood. So the mountain man learned to cut differently in winter than in summer. More controlled strikes, more attention to the grain of the wood, sometimes using a saw rather than an axe, because a saw was less likely to break and could be resharpened with a file, even if teeth were damaged. And he learned to listen to the wood as he cut it. Dry wood made a clean, sharp crack when split. Slightly damp wood made a duller thud. Wood with hidden rot would crumble rather than split cleanly. The sounds told him what he was working with, helped him make decisions about what to keep and what to discard. There was also the matter of bark. Some barks were valuable for fire starting. Birch bark, with its high oil content, would burn even when wet and could be used like paper to catch flames. The inner bark of cedar or juniper could be shredded into tinder. Pine bark, in thin sheets, made excellent fire-starting material if you scraped away the outer layer to expose the resinous inner layer. But other barks were problems. Cottonwood bark was thick and fibrous and didn't burn well at all. If you wanted to burn cottonwood, you had to peel or chop away most of the bark first, exposing the wood beneath. All of this knowledge was interconnected, forming a deep understanding of the forest as a living system that could provide for human needs if those needs were articulated correctly. The mountain man didn't see trees as obstacles or scenery. He saw them as a library of resources, each species with its own properties, each individual tree with its own character. Some modern people might think this sounds romantic, this deep communion with nature. And perhaps there was an element of that, but mostly it was pragmatic. The man who couldn't read the language of trees would struggle to maintain fire. He'd waste energy cutting the wrong wood. He'd wake cold in the night. He'd potentially fail to survive. So the mountain man became fluent in this language, not through books, but through direct experience, through cold nights and successful fires, through mistakes and their consequences, through observation of other experienced men, and through years of practice. There were other aspects to forest literacy beyond just fuel. The shape and spacing of trees told you about exposure to wind. Dense stands meant shelter. Isolated trees on ridges meant constant gale-force winds. Knowing this helped you choose campsites. The presence or absence of certain plants under the trees told you about drainage and soil moisture. Moss on the north side of trunks indicated which way was north when the sun was hidden. The way snow accumulated on branches indicated recent weather patterns. Trees that had shed their lower branches naturally were older growth. Those with branches all the way to the ground were younger, more opportunistic. This information helped predict the quality of wood you'd find. Dead trees with woodpecker holes meant insects, which meant the wood was beginning to decay from inside. Better to avoid those, unless you were desperate. Trees scarred by bear claws meant bears used this area, which might mean avoiding it during certain seasons or being extra cautious. But in deep winter, when bears were denned up, those same scarred trees became neutral landmarks, reference points for navigation. It was all connected, all part of a system of knowledge that was both wide and deep. And the mountain man living within this system for years at a time became a part of it. He wasn't dominating nature or conquering it. He was reading it, responding to it, working within its rules. Sometimes sitting by his fire in the evening, splitting wood into kindling. For the next morning, the mountain man might reflect on this knowledge, might feel a certain satisfaction in his competence. Or perhaps he didn't think about it at all. Perhaps it had simply become part of who he was, woven into his identity as deeply as language or memory. The fire crackles and another log is added. The wood, let's say it's a piece of standing dead lodgepole pine, catches quickly, the flames running up the dry grain, the heat pushing back another small boundary of cold. Tomorrow there will be more wood to gather, more choices to make more of this careful choreography with the forest. But tonight there is this fire built from knowledge and attention. And that's enough. That's everything. Your breathing has slowed now, hasn't it? The rhythm of this story is like the rhythm of a fire itself. Steady, persistent, a small light against great darkness. But enough, always enough. Let yourself drift with these images. The forest, the wood, the flames, the ancient simple transaction between cold and warmth, between human need and natural provision. It's all still there in some deep place waiting to be remembered. And in remembering, perhaps we find a different kind of warmth than what comes from a thermostat on a wall. There are moments in the deep night when you wake not knowing quite why. The room is dark. The world is silent. You lie there in that strange space between sleep and waking, and something in you checks, am I safe? Am I warm? Am I alone? For the mountain man in the winter wilderness, that middle of the night waking was a constant feature of existence. But his checking process was different. His first thought was always, is the fire still alive? Because in a very real sense, the fire was his companion, the one constant presence in a world of isolation and potential death. More than any human partner, more than his horse or his dog. If he had them, the fire was the thing he relied on completely. It demanded attention, feeding constant vigilance. And in return, it gave him the possibility of continuing to exist. Let's talk about fire not just as a tool or a technique, but as a relationship. Because that's what it became for men who spent months alone in frozen mountains. A relationship with all the complexity, all the give and take, all the emotional weight that word implies. Imagine a night in February, the darkest part of winter, when it feels like spring will never come. You've been in the mountains for 4 months now, barely seeing another human soul. Your last contact was at the autumn rendezvous, a gathering of trappers and traders, where you sold your beaver pelts and bought supplies. Since then, nothing but snow trees, stone and sky. The loneliness is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with great emotional storms. It's more subtle than that, more pervasive. It's the absence of conversation, the lack of another person's laugh, the way your own voice sounds strange when you occasionally speak aloud to yourself. It's the knowledge that if something goes wrong, if you break a leg, if you fall through ice, if you become sick, there is no help coming. You will deal with it yourself, or you will die. Those are the only options. In this context, the fire becomes more than fire. It becomes the marker of human presence in an inhuman landscape. Its light creates a bubble of the familiar. Its warmth is the only warmth you'll feel for months, besides your own body heat. Its crackling and popping are the only sounds besides natural ones. It becomes, in a very real psychological sense, alive. The mountain men recognized this. They wrote about it in their journals when they kept journals. They spoke about their fires as companions. Osborne Russell, on a particularly brutal winter night, wrote about sitting up with his fire like sitting up with a sick friend, feeding it, talking to it, watching over it. This wasn't mysticism or madness. It was a rational response to extreme isolation. The human mind needs connection. In the absence of human connection, it will form bonds with whatever is available. And a fire, with its constant movement, its need for care, its responsiveness to attention, its ability to live or die, based on your actions. Well, it's not so strange that it might begin to feel like a companion. So, our mountain man tends his fire with the kind of attention one might give to a relationship. He learns its moods. He understands what it needs at different times. He reads its signals. A fire burning with tall, bright flames is healthy, confident. It's saying, I have plenty of fuel and air. I'm warm and strong. You can relax for a bit. A fire burning low and blue is struggling. It's saying, I need more fuel or better fuel. I'm working hard just to stay alive. Help me soon. A fire that smokes heavily is unhappy. It's saying, something is wrong. The wood is too wet, or I'm not getting enough air, or both. Fix this, or I'll choke out. A fire that crackles, constantly sending up showers of sparks, is perhaps too happy, too energetic. It's burning resin-rich wood that's going quickly. It's saying, I'm spectacular right now, but I won't last. Think about what comes next. These aren't metaphors to the mountain man. This is how he thinks about fire, because this is what works. Anthropomorphizing the fire helps him predict its behavior, helps him respond appropriately, helps him keep it alive through circumstances that would kill a less attentive fire. At night, the fire's companionship becomes even more important. The darkness in the wilderness, far from any artificial light, is profound, in a way that's difficult to describe to people who've never experienced it. It's not just an absence of light. It's a presence, a weight. It presses in. And in winter, that darkness contains cold that can kill, and potentially predators that can kill, and definitely confusion that can lead to getting lost and then dying. The fire holds back all of that. Its circle of light is a small civilization, a tiny bubble of human control. Inside that circle, there is warmth and light and the ability to see threats coming. Outside, there is only the unknown. So the mountain man feeds his fire before bed, not carelessly, not just throwing on logs. He builds it up in a specific way. First, he makes sure he has a good bed of coals, which are the foundation of lasting heat. Then, He arranges larger logs in a structure that will burn slowly, progressively, without requiring intervention for several hours. Sometimes, this might be a star fire with logs radiating from the center like spokes, only their ends in the flames. As the ends burn down, the logs can be pushed further in extending the burn time. Sometimes, it might be a long fire, with logs laid parallel, burning slowly from one end. Sometimes, it might be a reflector fire, with logs stacked upright against each other, leaning at an angle, creating both heat and light directed toward the sleeping area. The architecture of the fire depends on many factors. How cold is it? How strong is the wind? How tired is he? Will he likely wake in the night anyway, or does he need this fire to last unattended until morning? These decisions are made without conscious thought after years of experience. The hands build the fire in the right way automatically, the same way a musician's fingers find the right keys without looking. And then, wrapped in his buffalo robe, or blankets with the fire built properly between him and his reflector wall, the mountain man settles into the strange sleep of the wilderness. Not the deep, unconscious sleep of a safe bedroom, but a lighter sleep, a vigilant sleep, where some part of the mind remains aware of sounds and changes in temperature and the status of the fire. He might wake every 2 or 3 hours, just for a moment. His eyes open. He registers that the fire has burned down, but is still alive, still producing heat. He might add another log, or might not, depending on how cold he is, and how many hours until dawn. Then he closes his eyes again and drifts back towards sleep. This interrupted sleep pattern is not restful in the way we think of rest. He'll never feel fully refreshed, but it's safe. And safety in the winter wilderness is a higher priority than comfort. In the morning, if he's managed it well, there will still be coals buried under ash. He'll carefully blow on them, add fine tinder, coax them back to flame, and the fire will live another day, another cycle, another dance of attention and survival. The relationship with fire extends beyond just nighttime comfort and warmth. Fire is also where food is prepared, where water is made safe to drink, where gear is dried and maintained, where the mountain man does the small crafts that keep his equipment functional. Cooking over a fire requires its own skill set. Unlike a modern stove with regulated heat and a timer, a wilderness fire is dynamic, constantly changing. The temperature at different heights above the coals varies dramatically. Right at the cold surface, it might be 500 degrees. 6 inches above it might be 300 degrees. A foot above may be 200. For boiling water, you want intense heat, so you hang your pot directly over flames or set it right on hot coals. For slow cooking a stew, you want steady, moderate heat, so you position your pot higher up over coals rather than flames. For roasting meat, you might suspend it on a green wood spit to one side of the fire, where it can cook from radiant heat without burning. All of this is adjusted constantly throughout the cooking process. Adding wood in the right places to increase heat where needed. Moving pots and spits to different positions. Reading the smoke and flame to predict what the fire will do in the next few minutes. And always, there's the awareness of fuel consumption. How much wood did I gather? How long do I need this fire to last? Am I burning through my wood supply too quickly? Should I bank the fire and let it coast on coals? Or do I need the heat badly enough to use wood faster? This kind of calculation becomes second nature. The mountain man doesn't think through these questions consciously. any more than you think through the mechanics of walking. His hands and eyes and instincts handle it automatically learned through countless repetitions. But fire isn't just practical. It's also psychological, especially during the long winter months when darkness falls by 4 in the afternoon and doesn't lift until 8 the next morning. 16 hours of night, week after week, month after month. In those long darkness hours, the fire is the center of the world. The mountain man might sit beside it, working on small tasks, sharpening his knife, mending a tear in his clothing, working on snowshoes, anything that can be done by firelight. Or he might simply sit and stare into the flames. Fire is endlessly watchable. The way flames move, never the same pattern twice, constantly shifting, dancing, always in motion, but never going anywhere. It's hypnotic, meditative. The mind can unfocus and simply watch, and in that unfocused watching, a kind of peace can develop. The mountain men were not generally philosophers in the formal sense. Most had little education. Many were illiterate. But they were thoughtful in their own way, shaped by solitude and hardship into men who observed carefully and reflected on what they saw. Sitting by a fire on a winter night, they might think about their lives, about the choices that brought them to this frozen wilderness, about whether they'd go back to civilization if they could, about what they'd lost by choosing this life and what they'd gained. They might think about death, which was never far away, about friends lost to the mountains, to accidents, to cold, to bears, to hostile encounters, about how close they themselves had come and probably would come again. They might think about the nature of the cold and the heat, about the battle being waged right here, the fire pushing back darkness and death for another few hours, about how temporary and fragile that victory was. Or they might think about nothing in particular, just letting the mind wander, watching the flames, feeling the heat on their face, feeling grateful to still be alive. In his journal, Osborne Russell describes nights like this with a kind of quiet poetry. He writes about the cheerful blaze and the solitary grandeur of the mountains. He writes about feeling more at peace in the wilderness than he ever felt in towns. He writes about the fire as a friend that never judged, never betrayed, never disappointed, as long as he held up his end of the relationship by feeding it and tending it. There's something profound in this image, a man alone with fire in immense darkness. It's one of the oldest human scenarios. It goes back to before recorded history, to the first humans who learned to make and control fire, who used it to push back the predators and the cold who gathered around it, and felt safe in numbers and warmth. The mountain man in the 1830s was living essentially the same experience as those ancient humans. The technology had barely changed. Flint and steel instead of rubbing sticks. But the fire itself was identical. The relationship was identical. The psychological reality was identical. And maybe that's part of why some men chose this life despite its hardships. Maybe there was something clarifying about that simplicity. You, the fire, the mountain. Nothing else. No society, no politics, no money, no status games. Just survival. Just the pure, clean relationship with elemental forces. Of course, romanticizing it would be a mistake. It was often miserable. Fingers and toes lost to frostbite. Weeks of eating only meat leading to cravings for vegetables that bordered on obsession. The terror of a fire that wouldn't light when you desperately needed it. The exhaustion of constant vigilance. The the loneliness that sometimes tipped into depression or worse. But there was also something real there, something authentic that perhaps gets lost in more comfortable lives. A directness, a clarity of purpose. You knew what mattered. Stay warm, find food, don't die. Everything else was luxury. And at the center of all of it, every day and every night, was fire. The companion that made all the rest possible. The steady presence. The small miracle of combustion that stood between existence and oblivion. The modern world has made fire optional, ornamental. We've lost the visceral understanding of what it means, what it does, how much we once depended on it. But it's still there, encoded in our biology, in the way we're drawn to flames, in the way a campfire on a cold night still produces a feeling of safety and comfort that goes beyond rational explanation. The mountain man knew fire in a way we don't, and probably can't. It was his companion, his tool, his lifeline, his meditation, his comfort. It demanded everything from him and gave him everything in return. And in that exchange, in that relationship of complete mutual dependence, there was something that approached love. Your own fire, metaphorically speaking, burns beside you now as you drift towards sleep. Perhaps it's actual warmth from a heater or a blanket. Perhaps it's just the safety of a modern room, the knowledge that you're protected from the cold outside. But it's there, keeping you safe, allowing you to rest. And somewhere in history, in a winter that was real and harsh and endless, a man sat beside his own fire and felt the same basic gratitude for warmth, for light, for another night survived. The fires are different, but the human need they serve is eternal. Let that thought settle into your deepening sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The darkness cannot reach you. Rest now as those mountain men rested, knowing that tomorrow brings its own challenges. But tonight there is this moment of peace beside the fire that never goes out. Not really. Not as long as humans remember what it meant and what it gave us. The body is a furnace. This is not a metaphor, but a biological fact. Every cell in your body is burning fuel glucose, primarily fats when necessary, in a process called cellular respiration. This process generates heat as a byproduct, and that heat maintains your core temperature at approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When the external temperature is 70 degrees, maintaining this internal furnace is relatively easy. When the external temperature is 40 degrees below zero, maintaining it becomes a monumental challenge that requires constant fuel. The mountain men of the 1830s understood this in a direct physical way that most modern people never experience. They knew that food was not just pleasure or nutrition in some abstract sense. Food was quite literally fuel for the furnace. Without enough of it, particularly without enough of the right kinds of it, the body's ability to generate heat would fail, and death would follow as surely as a fire dying from lack of wood. Let's explore the relationship between food fat and survival in extreme cold. It's a story that takes us deep into the practical reality of winter wilderness existence, and also into one of the most misunderstood aspects of human nutrition. Picture our mountain man in late January. He's been in the high country for 3 months now. The initial supplies he packed in during autumn are mostly exhausted. He's down to the absolute basics, a little cornmeal perhaps, some salt, maybe a bit of coffee, if he's been careful with it. Everything else he needs, he has to obtain from the land itself. In summer, this would mean a varied diet. wild plants, berries, roots, fish from streams, small game like rabbits and birds, occasional larger game like deer or elk. But this is winter. The plants are dead or dormant. The streams are frozen solid. Many animals have either migrated to lower elevations or are in hibernation. The available food sources have narrowed dramatically. What remains are the animals that stay active through winter, primarily deer, elk, moose, mountain sheep, and occasionally bear if you're lucky enough to find one denned up. Also available are beaver, though getting them in winter means breaking through ice. And somewhat surprisingly, bison. Though we tend to think of bison as plains animals. In the 1830s, there were mountain bison populations that had adapted to high elevation winters. So the mountain man hunts. Or more accurately, he must hunt successfully, because without meat, he cannot survive. A single day without food in these temperatures would be manageable, but uncomfortable. A second day would bring weakness and clouded thinking. A third day would be genuinely dangerous. The body, pushed to maintain warmth without external fuel, would begin cannibalizing itself, breaking down muscle tissue for energy, leading to a downward spiral of weakening that could become irreversible. But here's what's crucial, what the mountain men learned through observation and bitter experience. Not all meat is created equal in terms of its ability to sustain you through extreme cold. Lean meat, while nutritious, is actually insufficient on its own. This seems counterintuitive. Meat is protein. Protein is essential. Surely eating plenty of meat would keep you healthy. But no. There's a condition documented by indigenous peoples and early explorers called rabbit starvation, or sometimes mal de caribou. The name comes from the observation that a person could eat rabbit until they were full 3 times a day every day and still slowly waste away and die. The problem is that very lean meat provides protein and not much else. The body can convert protein into energy through a process called gluconeogenesis, but it's inefficient and produces toxic byproducts. Without adequate fat or carbohydrates, the body simply cannot function properly, no matter how much protein you consume. Early symptoms include diarrhea and fatigue. If continued, it leads to severe weight loss, weakness, and eventually death, even though caloric intake might technically be sufficient. The mountain men didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew the practical result. They knew that lean rabbit meat, while fine as occasional food or as a supplement, couldn't sustain them through winter. They needed fat, lots of it, as much as they could possibly get. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient available. 1 gram of fat contains 9 calories compared to 4 calories per gram for protein or carbohydrates. But beyond just caloric density, fat is essential for numerous bodily functions, particularly in cold weather. It insulates from the inside, providing additional thermal protection. It slows digestion, providing sustained energy release rather than quick spikes. It's necessary for the absorption of certain vitamins. And crucially, it can be burned efficiently for heat production without producing harmful metabolic byproducts. In extreme cold, the mountain men needed approximately 5,000 to 6,000 calories per day just to maintain their body weight. This is roughly double what an average modern person needs. That's a staggering amount of food. To put it in perspective, that's like eating 8 Big Macs every single day. Except the mountain man didn't have convenient fast food. He had whatever he could kill and carry. So he prioritized fat, actively, deliberately, with single-minded focus. When he killed a deer or elk, He didn't just take the muscle meat. He took everything, but he especially prized the fat deposits. Around the kidneys, there's a type of fat called sweat, hard and waxy, which could be rendered down and used for numerous purposes. The bone marrow, that soft, creamy substance inside the long bones, was nearly pure fat and was considered a delicacy. The brain, surprisingly high in fat content, was eaten fresh or used in tanning leather. Even the eyes, which contained fatty tissue, were consumed. The hide itself, if it still had fat adhering to the inner surface, would be scraped, and that fat saved. Nothing was wasted. Nothing fatty was discarded. This wasn't primitive gorging. This was sophisticated nutrition in a context where fat scarcity was a genuine threat to survival. But there was a problem. Deer and elk, while they carried fat into winter, gradually depleted those stores as the season progressed. By late winter, a deer might be almost skeletal, its fat reserves consumed by the same survival pressures the mountain man himself faced. Hunting lean game in late winter meant the mountain man faced the specter of rabbit starvation, even while successfully bringing down large animals. This is where buffalo became critically important to the fur trade economy. Buffalo were fat even in winter. They had the mass and the grazing ability to maintain substantial fat deposits throughout the cold months. A buffalo cow in good condition might provide 50 to 80 pounds of tallow that rendered fat that could be stored and consumed over weeks. The hump on a buffalo's back was particularly prized because it was nearly pure fat and required minimal rendering. A mountain man who successfully killed a buffalo in winter had struck survival gold. He would camp near the carcass for days, gorging on the fatty meat, feeling his body respond with warmth and energy, possibly for the first time in weeks. He'd render out the tallow, pour it into a skin container, store it carefully for future use. He might even make pemmican. Pemmican deserves special attention because it was perhaps the ultimate wilderness survival food. The word comes from the Cree language, and the food itself was widely used by plains tribes before being adopted by fur traders. The recipe is simple, but the execution requires knowledge. Take lean meat, slice it thin, dry it thoroughly over smoke or in the sun. When it's completely desiccated, pound it into a powder. Then mix this meat powder with rendered fat in approximately equal parts. Sometimes dried berries, choke cherries or service berries were added for flavor and additional nutrition. The mixture was packed into hide bags and sealed with more fat poured over the top. The result was a food that could last for years without spoiling, that was incredibly calorie-dense, that provided both protein and fat in easily digestible form, and that required no preparation to eat. A pound of pemmican could contain 3,000 calories or more. A man could carry enough pemmican to sustain himself for weeks, even in the depths of winter, without needing to hunt at all. But pemmican was a luxury for most mountain men, requiring successful hunts and enough surplus to prepare it. More often, they were eating fresh meat cooked directly over the fire, with the fat dripping down and being consumed along with the protein. The cooking methods they used were designed to preserve as much fat as possible. Boiling was avoided when feasible, because fat would float on the water's surface and could be lost. Roasting was preferred with the meat positioned, so drippings could be caught and consumed. Sometimes meat was cooked directly in fat, essentially deep frying it, if enough rendered tallow was available. And they didn't just eat the obvious cuts. They ate organs which tend to be fatty and also nutritionally dense. The liver rich in stored vitamins and with a smooth fatty texture. The heart a muscle, but one that accumulates fat differently than skeletal muscle. The tongue surprisingly fatty and considered a premium cut. Intestines cleaned and sometimes stuffed with other food and roasted. Kidneys dense and rich. To a modern person, this might sound unappetizing or even disturbing. We're accustomed to sanitized meat from grocery stores' specific cuts that bear little resemblance to the animal they came from. But the mountain man saw the whole animal as food, and good food at that, each part with its own character and nutritional profile. There was also beaver tail, which requires specific mention because it was such a prized food among mountain men. A beaver tail is essentially a flat paddle of fat covered in a scaly skin. To prepare it, you'd roast the tail over coals until the skin blistered and could be peeled away, revealing the fatty flesh beneath. This flesh, when cooked, had a rich gelatinous texture, almost like pure rendered fat, but with more substance. A large beaver tail might be 2 or 3 pounds of nearly pure fat. Finding a beaver lodge in winter and successfully trapping enough beaver to have access to their tails was cause for real celebration. Beyond just killing and eating fatty animals, the mountain men had to understand the seasonality of fat availability. Animals accumulated fat in autumn, preparing for winter. They burned through that fat as winter progressed. By late winter and early spring, even healthy animals might be quite lean. This meant that the best time to hunt for fat was early to midwinter. But this conflicted with other survival priorities. Early winter was when you most wanted to be at a secure camp, getting established, building up firewood reserves. Hunting became more necessary in late winter when stored food ran out, but that was exactly when game was leanest. The mountain men navigated this tension by being opportunistic. They'd take any good hunting opportunity that presented itself regardless of timing. A fresh elk track in December meant pursuing it immediately, even if it disrupted other plans. You couldn't predict when such opportunities would arise, and passing them up might mean starvation later. They also learned to store fat when they had excess. Rendered tallow kept in a skin bag, and frozen would last months. Meat frozen solid on the bone could be kept almost indefinitely in winter temperatures. Some mountain men would create small caches burying food under snow and rocks, marking the location and returning to it when needed. This required choosing locations carefully away from where wolves or bears might find it, but accessible even if heavy snow fell. The entire relationship with food in the winter wilderness was unlike anything most of us experience. Food was not guaranteed. It was not convenient. It was not a matter of preference or taste. It was survival. The mountain man thought about food constantly, not because he was gluttonous, but because his body demanded it, and finding it required constant effort. When he did have food, especially fatty food, he ate to excess by modern standards. A mountain man might consume 5 or 6 pounds of meat in a sitting, particularly if it was fatty meat after a period of deprivation. His stomach, adapted to this feast or famine existence, could handle these enormous meals. And the calories would be stored as body fat, giving him a reserve for the next time hunting was unsuccessful. This is perhaps where the biggest difference from modern life becomes apparent. We live in an environment of food surplus. Obesity is a major health problem. We're told to restrict calories to avoid fat, to eat in moderation. But the mountain man's body was doing exactly the opposite of everything modern nutrition advice tells us. He was actively trying to gain weight to accumulate body fat, to eat as much as possible whenever possible. And this wasn't unhealthy for him, it was essential for his survival. When you're burning 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day, just staying alive when you might go days without eating. When the next meal is always uncertain. The body's ability to store excess food as fat is not a bug, but a feature. It's insurance. It's survival. The psychological relationship with food in these conditions is complex. There's the simple pleasure of eating when hungry, of course, that basic satisfaction that connects us to every living thing. But there's also a deeper gratitude, an awareness of the animal's sacrifice, of the effort required to obtain the food, of the fragility of the food supply. Some mountain men reported that eating alone in the wilderness, especially after days of hunger, could be almost a spiritual experience. The food tasted better than any meal in civilization. The warmth spreading through the body as calories were absorbed and burned felt like a resurrection. The knowledge that you had succeeded, that you had food for another day, brought a satisfaction that no amount of restaurant dining could match. And there were special occasions when excess was possible and celebration appropriate. When multiple trappers gathered at a rendezvous, when a particularly successful hunt brought down multiple animals, when supplies arrived from the trading posts. These were times for feasting, for eating, until utterly stuffed for the pure pleasure of abundance after scarcity. The mountain men would gorge their bodies, demanding it making up for the lean times, storing every possible calorie against future need. In Osborne Russell's journal, he describes one such feast where his party killed multiple buffalo. They ate non-stop for 2 days, trying every cut, every organ rendering fat just to drink it warm and thick. It sounds excessive, perhaps disgusting to our modern sensibilities. But Russell describes it with pure joy, the joy of a body finally getting what it desperately needed. There's a moment in that journal where Russell reflects on the difference between the food concerns of civilization and the food concerns of the mountain. In civilization, people worried about variety, about spices, about presentation. In the mountain, he wrote, there was only one concern: was there enough? And was it fatty enough? Everything else was luxury. This singular focus on fat and calories might seem simplistic, but it was actually sophisticated in its own way. The mountain men had figured out through trial and error, through observing indigenous practices, through their own bodies' responses, exactly what nutrition was needed for extreme cold survival. They distilled it down to essentials: fat for fuel protein, for maintenance salt, for electrolytes. Everything else was bonus. Modern nutritional science has largely confirmed what they knew instinctively. High-fat diets are indeed appropriate for cold weather activity. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic traditionally ate diets that were 80% fat by calories, and they were healthy and vigorous in conditions that made the Rockies look temperate. The mountain men weren't quite eating at that level, but they were close, and for the same reasons. As you lie there, now warm and comfortable, perhaps you're becoming aware of your own body's warmth. That internal furnace burning away, maintaining your temperature automatically without conscious thought. You fed it earlier today, and it's processing that food, extracting the energy, distributing the heat. It's doing what human bodies have always done, what the mountain man's body did in those frozen mountains. The difference is that your furnace has an easy job. The temperature is comfortable. The fuel is abundant and will be abundant again tomorrow. But the mechanism is the same. The same cellular respiration. The same conversion of food into heat and energy. The same ancient process that kept humans alive through ice ages and across continents. The mountain man honored his internal furnace by feeding it properly, by prioritizing the fuel it needed over mere taste preferences, by understanding that the body's demands in extreme conditions overrode any philosophical ideas about diet or eating. Survival made everything clear, stripped away all the complications we modern people add to the simple act of eating. And in that clarity, there was a kind of freedom. The mountain man didn't worry about eating too much. He ate what he had as much as he could whenever he could. His body would sort out what to do with it. His body was wise in ways his mind couldn't fully comprehend. It knew what it needed, and it told him through hunger, through cravings, through the deep satisfaction of fatty meat after days of deprivation. So he ate, and the internal fire burned, and warmth spread through his body, radiating from his core to his extremities, pushing back the cold for another day. Just as the external fire pushed back the darkness, the internal fire pushed back the chill that always wanted to invade from outside. Two fires then, one made of wood and tended by hand, one made of food and tended by the body's own wisdom, both essential, both demanding constant attention and fuel, both the difference between life and death. Your own eyes are heavy now. Your breathing is slow and steady. Your body, well fed and warm, is ready for sleep. The internal fire burns at maintenance level, keeping you perfectly comfortable, asking nothing of you except rest. Let it do its work. Let yourself drift with the knowledge that these ancient mechanisms still function, still keep you alive, still connect you to every human who ever lived, including those mountain men in their frozen wilderness, eating by firelight, grateful for fat and warmth. And another night survived. Sleep comes easier with a full stomach, doesn't it? The mountain men knew that too. On nights when they'd eaten well, sleep was deeper, more restorative. On nights when they were hungry, sleep was fitful and cold. But tonight, you need not worry. You've eaten. You're warm. And sleep is here, patient and welcoming, ready to give you the rest you need. Let it take you now. The story continues, even in sleep, in that place where all human stories eventually wind their way, where the mountain man's dreams and yours might not be so different after all. Dreams of warmth, of safety, of another dawn, coming of fires, burning of the simple, profound satisfaction of survival. Morning comes again, as it always does, though in the depth of winter it comes reluctantly, the sun barely climbing above the southern horizon before beginning its descent again. The mountain man has been up for hours, as is his habit, using the dim pre-dawn light to accomplish tasks that daylight will make easier. He sits by the early fire repairing a snowshoe. A broken binding in the heart of winter is no small thing. Without it, he would sink waist-deep in the powder, making hunting impossible and travel a struggle for survival. He works methodically, weaving sinew through the wooden frame as his breath fogs the air. It is a clear, mild morning, though the blue sky promises a bitter freeze once the sun dips. As he works, he realizes how much he has changed. The man who entered these mountains 3 years ago is gone. It isn't just the lean muscle or the chest-length beard. It is his mind. he has acquired what can only be called the quiet knowing. This state begins with the end of human noise. In the wilderness, the constant chatter of society fades, replaced by a deep, non-human silence. At first, the mind struggles inventing imaginary conversations to fill the void. But eventually, the internal noise dies down. He starts to observe more and narrate less. He sees the world directly without the filter of words. He notices the specific quality of light that foretells a storm, or the subtle difference in how wind sounds through pine versus aspen. He reads tracks not by logic, but by intuition, feeling the story of the animal as if he were part of the woods himself. This life has taught him a rare humility. He doesn't see himself as a master of nature, but as a participant in it. He has learned to hold his plans lightly, accepting that a blizzard or a lack of game can change everything in an instant. He doesn't waste energy worrying about what he cannot control. Even death is no longer a spectre to be feared, but a neighbor to be respected. He is realistic, not paranoid, attentive, not anxious. Time, too, has shifted. Without clocks, he moves with the sun and the seasons. There is no rush, only the task at hand. Whether he is walking through the forest or mending a tool, he is entirely present. In this solitude, he has found a liberating self-knowledge. With no one to perform for, he knows exactly who he is and what he values. He has discovered the peace of enough food, enough warmth, enough shelter. In a world that always demands more, he finds freedom in sufficiency. He finishes the repair and tests the frame. It will hold. He sits for a moment, watching the smoke rise straight into the still air. He is at home in a place that could kill him, yet he is at peace. This quiet knowing is a reminder that even in a loud world, we can choose to let go of the noise, pay attention to the small things, and find contentment in the present moment. Sleep is close now. Let that gentle weight pull you down. The mountain man is at his fire, and you are safe in your rest. The fire burns low in the evening of this long imagined day. The mountain man has eaten, has completed his tasks, has prepared for another night of interrupted sleep in sub-zero darkness. He sits with his back against the reflector wall, wrapped in his buffalo robe, and allows his mind to wander. He's thinking about civilization, that distant place he left behind years ago. Not with longing exactly, but with a kind of anthropological curiosity. What are they doing right now, those people in their cities and towns? What do they worry about? What occupies their days? He tries to recall his old life, but the memories feel like a stranger's dream. The pursuit of status, the hunger for wealth, the endless social maneuvering. It all seems alien now, belong to a world he no longer recognizes. In the quiet of the peaks, he faces the question every mountain man eventually asks: was it worth it? The answer is rarely simple. To choose the mountains is to embrace a life of profound loss. He has traded the warmth of a home and the safety of medicine for the bite of the wind and the risk of a lonely death. He has stepped outside the grand narrative of progress, living instead by rhythms that haven't changed in 10,000 years. To the civilized world, this is a tragedy. To him, it might be the only true liberation. What was lost was not innocence. There was nothing innocent about the fur trade or frontier life. It was brutal and often cruel to people and to animals. What was lost was not some perfect harmony with nature. The mountain men and the indigenous peoples before them altered their environments significantly, sometimes destructively. What was lost was something harder to name. It was a certain kind of knowledge embedded in practice and experience, rather than written in books. It was the knowledge of how to live directly with the natural world, without elaborate intermediaries. It was the knowledge of your own capabilities tested against real challenges. It was the knowledge of sufficiency and limits. It was the kind of embodied wisdom that can only come from years of paying attention to the world around you, with your survival depending on that attention. This knowledge still exists in fragments. Indigenous communities maintain pieces of it. Backcountry guides and wilderness experts maintain pieces of it. But as a widespread cultural knowledge, as something that most people in a society understand, it's largely gone. We've traded it for other things: comfort, convenience, specialization, technology, abundance. Whether that was a good trade is an open question. The mountain man adds another log to his fire, watching the flames lick up around it, feeling the pulse of heat on his face. Tomorrow, he'll wake and do this all again. The same careful attention to detail, the same respect for the cold and the distance and the danger, the same quiet competence that has kept him alive for years. How much longer will he continue? That's uncertain. Some mountain men lasted a decade or more in the wilderness. Others lasted only a season or two before death or discouragement drove them out. Russell himself would eventually leave, would try to return to civilization, would find himself permanently changed by his years in the mountains, unable to fully fit back into the world he left behind. That's perhaps the final truth about this way of life. It changes you. Not in superficial ways, but fundamentally. You can't spend years in extreme conditions, in constant negotiation with survival in deep solitude, and remain the same person you were. The wilderness shapes you the way water shapes stone, slowly but inexorably. And once shaped that way, once you've learned the quiet knowing, once you've experienced what it means to be fully competent in a real environment, once you've felt the satisfaction of true sufficiency, going back becomes complicated. You might return to civilization physically, but part of you remains in the mountains by the fire, watching the flames at peace with less, because you know that less is enough. Some mountain men handled this better than others. Some made the transition back to social life successfully, bringing their wilderness wisdom with them, integrating it into a new kind of existence. Others never could. They'd try town life for a few months, then feel the pull of the mountains and head back out, unable to tolerate the constraints and complications of civilization. Russell was somewhere in between. He left the mountains, eventually settled in Oregon, tried farming, tried various businesses. But he kept journals his whole life, kept writing about those winters in the Rockies, kept returning in memory to those moments by the fire when everything was simple and clear and sufficiently. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the mountain men. Not their economic contribution to the fur trade, which was significant but temporary. Not their role in opening the West to settlement, which was real but problematic. But their demonstration of what humans are capable of when stripped down to essentials, when forced to rely on knowledge and skill rather than accumulated technology, when living in direct relationship with the natural world. They showed that we're more capable than we think, that we can adapt to extraordinary conditions, that we can find contentment with very little, that we can develop deep competence through attention and practice, that we can face death calmly if we accept it as part of life, that we can find meaning in simplicity, These are not lessons that most modern people want to learn. They require giving up too much comfort, too much security. And perhaps that's fine. There's no moral requirement to suffer through winter wilderness to learn wisdom. Other paths exist. But it's worth knowing that these mountain men were not so different from us. They had the same basic human nature, the same needs and fears and hopes. What they had that we largely don't is a context that stripped away everything inessential and left only what mattered most. And in that stripping away, they discovered things about human capability and resilience that remain true even in our comfortable modern world. The fire burns on as night deepens. The mountain man settles into his buffalo robe, positions himself carefully to stay warm through the long, dark hours. He's not thinking about legacy or lessons or what future generations might learn from his choices. He's thinking about tomorrow, about the traps he needs to check, about whether the weather will hold. But his existence itself is a kind of teaching, a demonstration of human possibility. And across the centuries, we can still learn from it if we're willing to listen to what those flames are saying, to what that silence is teaching, to what that simple, satisfied existence in harsh conditions tells us about what we actually need to be content. Your own breathing is very slow now, very deep. The rhythm of sleep is almost upon you. Just a little further, just the final piece of this story, and then you can release completely into rest. The mountain man is already halfway there himself, hovering in that space between waking and sleeping, between the fire's warmth and the night's cold, between his past in civilization and his present in the wilderness. He's at peace, as much as anyone can be in such a place, in such a life. And that peace, that hard-won, simple peace, is perhaps the final lesson. That contentment is possible under the most unlikely circumstances. That humans can adapt to almost anything. That less truly can be enough. That the quiet knowing once found brings a satisfaction that no amount of comfort or convenience can quite match. Let that thought carry you into sleep now. You're safe, you're warm, you're at rest. And somewhere in the past, by a fire that burned real and bright, a mountain man found the same peace you're finding now, in his own way, on his own terms, under his own stars. Sleep now. The journey is complete. The fire will burn through the night, as it always has, as it always will in memory and story, and in the deep places of human consciousness, where we remember what it meant to survive on nothing but skill and knowledge and attention. Sleep. Morning light is filtering through your window, or perhaps it's still dark where you are. Time moves differently in stories than it does in sleep. But wherever you are, whenever you're hearing this, I hope you've found some rest, some peace in these hours we've spent together. We've traveled far, you and I. Back to the winter of 1830, to the Rocky Mountains, to a world that existed and then vanished, leaving behind only journals and artifacts and stories. We've walked with the mountain men through their daily struggles, felt the cold they felt, understood the knowledge they carried, witnessed the quiet wisdom they developed. What stays with you from this journey? Perhaps it's the image of fire crackling in darkness, pushing back the cold. Perhaps it's the understanding of how much humans can endure when necessary. Perhaps it's the lesson about sufficiency, about knowing what enough means. Perhaps it's simply the peaceful voice of history telling you that others have faced hardship and found their way through. Whatever it is, it's yours to keep. These stories belong to all of us, part of our shared human heritage. The mountain men are long gone, but what they learned, what they demonstrated about human capability and resilience, that remains. It remains in these stories, in these quiet, late-night tellings, in the space between sleep and waking, where past and present dissolve together. I want to thank you for spending this time with me, for allowing these old stories to accompany you towards sleep or through a sleepless night, or into whatever peaceful rest you found. Creating these journeys into the past is my privilege and my pleasure, and knowing that they serve some purpose for you, that they bring comfort or interest, or simply a distraction from whatever troubles might have kept you awake, that means more than I can say. If you've found value in tonight's story, if you'd like to continue these nocturnal journeys through history together, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, more winters to survive, more human experiences to explore. The past is vast and full of voices that deserve to be heard, and I'm here to help those voices reach you night after night for as long as you'll have me. And if you'd like to share your own thoughts, your own reflections on what we've explored tonight, the comments section is always open. I read them all, though I confess I can't respond to everyone. But I read them, and I learn from them, and they help shape the stories I tell next. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? What drew you to this particular story? I'd genuinely love to know. But that's all supplementary. The main thing, the important thing, is that you rest. That whatever brought you here tonight, whatever need or want or simple curiosity, that it's been satisfied, that you found what you were looking for or something close enough. The fire burns low in our imagined camp. The mountain man sleeps or tries to sleep, wrapped in his buffalo robe under the winter stars. The cold presses in, but the fire holds it back. Dawn will come, as it always does, bringing another day of survival, another day of quiet competence in the face of harsh realities. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight there is rest, and for you the same. Tomorrow will come with its own challenges, its own demands. But tonight, right now, there's only this moment of peace, this quiet darkness, this gentle drift towards sleep, or deeper into it if you're already there. This sense that the world, for all its complexity and difficulty, is fundamentally manageable. That humans have always found ways to survive, to adapt, to carry on. That you too carry that same resilience somewhere inside, whether you need it today or not. Let yourself be carried now, by sleep if it will have you, by these stories if sleep remains elusive, by the simple knowledge that you're not alone, that others across the world are listening to this same voice, taking this same journey, finding their own peace in the shared experience of history and story, and the fundamental human need for rest. The mountains stand eternal, though the men who walked them are dust. The cold still comes each winter, though no one survives it quite the way those mountain men did. The fire still offers its ancient comfort, though we light it with switches instead of flint and steel. The stories remain, connecting past to present, sleeper to sleeper voice, to listening ear in the quiet hours when the day's noise finally falls away. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me keep you company through these dark hours. Until we meet again, whether tomorrow night or whenever you need another journey through history's quieter corners, I wish you deep rest, peaceful dreams, and the gentle certainty that morning always comes bringing with it another chance to begin again. Sleep well, friend. The fire burns on. Good night.